This is the third and final section of my conversation on Percival Everett's James. In this part, you can hear recommendations from Sheri-Marie, Andrew, Arin, and Matt on similar and related writing. Please let us know in the comments if you've read any of these or if you have any recommendations of your own. Welcome to the third and final part of this discussion on Percival Everett's James. If you haven't seen parts 1 and 2, I do suggest you watch or listen to those first. We had a very detailed and fascinating discussion on both James and Huckleberry Finn. So in this section, we're going to hear some recommendations for literature that's in some way related. I have no idea what everybody's going to recommend, so looking forward to hearing what you have to say. And I'm just going to go clockwise on my screen. So Sheri-Marie, you're first. What would you recommend for readers of James?
So as I said in the previous section, I think Toni Morrison's Playing in the Dark is really important for thinking about exactly what James is satirizing as it relates to race and the American literary imagination in James. And another one that I think is interesting to put alongside James too is Marlon James's The Book of Night Women, which is also about slavery, but slavery on a plantation in Jamaica. There are a lot of angry enslaved people in that one, and it deals with violence in similar ways. I think it's important, as I said at the beginning of the conversation, to not think about James as an exceptional text in this moment. It may be an exceptional text in the American letters, in the U.S. letters, but it's a part of a larger conversation around how narratives about people of African descent have been produced and disseminated, and authors like Marlon James and Percival Everett are satirizing narrative forms and satirizing a lot of canonical things in order to disrupt those perspectives, particularly for people of color. So those two, Morrison's Playing in the Dark and Marlon James's The Book of Night Women.
Great, thank you. Okay, Matt, you're next up.
Yeah, I mean, I would be remiss if I didn't recommend a little bit of Mark Twain. And so the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is too obvious, but the story I would recommend, which I think really sets him on the path towards writing Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. It's this first work of Black dialect. Is called A True Story Repeated Word for Word as I Heard It. It was the first thing he ever published in the Atlantic Monthly. And it's essentially a retelling of an oral narrative that he heard about a woman being separated from her children during a human auction and then reunited with the youngest of them during Sherman's March.
Wow, fascinating. So we got retellings and retellings, and yes, whole history of Twain's interest in dialect there.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to add a work of criticism that I think is one way into James, which is Shelley Fisher Fishkin's Was Huck Black? Mm. And then finally, and maybe most enthusiastically, this history by Walter Johnson called River of Dark Dreams, Slavery and Empire in the Cotton Kingdom. If you want to get a feel for the geography, the political complexity, the legal complexity that Andy was talking about, as well as the sort of cultural networks of the Mississippi River Valley during the 1840s, 1850s, and indeed back further and forward farther. It's just an incredible book. I personally don't think I fully became a Twain scholar until I read it.
Ringing endorsement. Great. Thank you for bringing in some critical work as well. Arin, you're next.
I think I'm going to make a couple of recommendations within Everett's vast body of work. So the obvious one for me is probably The Trees. And this is a novel of lynching. It's about the kind of legacies of Emmett Till, and its story kind of unpacks the complexities of that history of lynching from the early 20th century up until police shootings, which it figures as a form of lynching. And in that way, obviously works really well with James, which is the story of this protagonist who's constantly in under the threat of lynching and feels that kind of visceral sense of terror and fear. So I think that they complement each other in that specific way. I also kind of more obscurely would point to this unusual and underrated collection of poetry by Everett called Swimming Swimmers Swimming, because there are so many poems about rivers in this collection. And I think another thing that James does is that it does some interesting things with the perhaps overdetermined symbol of the river, and the river currents and cross currents. And I think reading it together with some of these poems is potentially kind of productive thing to do. And I guess the last thing that kind of comes to my mind, and just now, just listening to Sheri and to Andy talk about Fanon, I think Sheri-Marie mentioned Black Skin, White Mass, and Andy was talking about justified violence. So it occurs to me that reading James alongside The Wretched of the Earth, particularly that on violence chapter where it talks about the justification of violence under colonialism, would be a productive thing to do as well. But those would be my two Everett recommendations, this collection of poetry and The Trees.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay. Andy, you're up.
So Arin said everything I would say about The Trees, so that I don't have to. Matt mentioned Walter Johnson, and I would say Walter Johnson's other book, The Broken Heart of America, and also work by another historian, Angela Zimmerman, really captures the complexity of Missouri, particularly during the Civil War era, and the way in which it was kind of oddly a stateless place, because if you know the history, it was a place where slavery existed, but it did not join the Confederacy, so it had a weird relationship to the United States during the Civil War. And both of those historians are very much interested in the question of what kind of agency the enslaved and formerly enslaved had, and how they used that agency in revolutionary ways. And the way that they worked in conjunction with a lot of German emigres who left Europe after 1848 because they were communist, and came and sort of famously settled in Missouri, joined the Union Army. And so it's a kind of slice of American history that people don't know, and that I think is kind of relevant to thinking through some of the things James is doing. The other thing I would say, finally, is, obviously, extremely important to read James in conjunction with the book that it's directly addressing, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, but it's really just a kind of like primer on world literature in general. And, I was going to say people should read Candide, but also a kind of quirkier thing is, the motif of the books found in a backpack is a direct call out to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And I think it's very interesting to read this novel in relationship to Frankenstein. So, Frankenstein in particular, Candide in particular, but I would also just say, there are so many references and so much intertextuality in this book that really, it's important to explore all of those elements of the book.
Thank you. Yeah, as you were speaking, actually, there are some quite direct and obvious references, but there's kind of tentacular outreach to many, many more layers than actually had occurred to me and you guys have brought up. So thank you for doing that. And thank you for your recommendations. Thank you for a fantastic conversation. I think, for people who have read James already or planning to, there's so much in what you said that just, goes into these layers and layers of depth, that I think will make it a novel that's talked about for a long, long time. So thank you all for joining me and for giving your time. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the World Literature Podcast. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.